welcome back to the NPTEL online certification course on tribal studies in India, interdisciplinary perspectives and approaches. Today we will be doing lecture number 35, and in this lecture we will be specifically looking at the constitutional provisions pertaining to tribal communities in India, and within that we will specifically examine the administrative and autonomy provisions. Now, before I go into the details of the lecture, so in the last several lectures we have talked extensively about the history of tribes, the context on the way in which the term tribe have been used, and also most importantly we really look at the interaction or the encounter between the colonial state and the tribal communities. Now, the period of colonialism was very important, as you know, in terms of how the colonial state or the Britishers responded to the tribal question in India, and in doing so they charted out several laws and regulations pertaining to tribal communities in India. Now, one of the most important questions particularly in the context of tribal communities in India is the question of autonomy. Now, in the colonial period, as we have already seen, what tribal communities in India have been gradually dispossessed from the several kinds of resources such as land, water, forests, so on and so forth. Now, this dispossession from different kinds of natural resources resulted into rebellions, resulted into unrest, resulted into social movements, and it continues so even in post-colonial period. Now, the colonial state introduced several legislations, and in post-independent India also, one of the most important or the central question pertaining to tribal communities was the question of autonomy. Now, in this context, the question of autonomy particularly for the tribes becomes very pertinent because of the way of their experience during colonialism, that they see that they have been gradually dispossessed from their habitats. They have been gradually denied customary ownerships in terms of land, forest, water, so on and so forth, and that resulted into a severe pauperization, immerserization of tribal communities. So, to really understand and situate the context in which the post-colonial Indian state decided to grant autonomy provisions, it is important to go back go a little backwards in terms of trying to really understand why did tribal communities in India, particularly during the period of the drafting of the Indian constitutions, fought actually for the provisions of autonomy. Now, two very important provisions that we will discuss in this lecture is the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule. Now, as you know the Indian constitution is is a very one of the most renowned constitution in the world, and in the last several lectures we have really looked at how tribal communities themselves have participated and contributed to the making of the Indian constitution. Now, one thing that is very special and unique about a constitution is that India being a diverse country, the constitution tries to cater to the need of this diverse population by coming up with specific provisions to safeguard the interests of different communities across caste, religion, region and community wise. So, in terms of tribes, a constitutional arrangement in the form of autonomy provisions were inserted in the Indian constitution. Now, this insertion definitely came with the kind of pressures that the Indian nationalist leaders were exposed to, or in some sense they were forced to listen to the voice of the tribal communities. But then this insertion of autonomy provisions also came with a commitment to assure the tribal communities that their rights and their interests will be protected under the Constitution of India. So, it was in this spirit that the Indian constitution or the Constitution of India has provided a special system of administration for the tribal dominated areas in the form of 5th and the 6th schedules. Now, so these schedules are very important because they continue to be the foundation, or they continue to be the foundational structure of autonomy provisions for tribal communities in India. So, the 6th schedule provisions basically is for administration of tribal areas in the northeastern part of India, particularly in the state of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram. Now, to go a little backward again, that at the time of independence, Northeast India was essentially Assam and the two princely states, that is Tripura and Manipur. over a period of time from 1963, many of these today's states like Mizoram, Meghalaya, even Nagaland were part of Assam districts, were just one district during the for a long period of time. So, Nagaland break away from Assam in 1963, Meghalaya was granted a separate statehood in 1972, Mizoram was also granted a separate statehood in 1986 along with Arunachal Pradesh. So, therefore, over a period of time we see that there has been reorganization of the northeastern region. Now, on independence, it means that the 6th schedule provisions was was implemented in the larger Assam, particularly in the tribal dominated districts of today's Meghalaya and Mizoram. So, in the case of the 5th schedule, the schedule deals primarily with the administration of scheduled areas in particularly in mainland India or in central India. So, currently today we have 10 states which comes under the 5th schedule, such as Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha, Jharkhand and Telangana. Now, the spirit behind the introduction of autonomy provisions may vary between the two regions. We are taking the northeastern region and the mainland India in a very broad category. This does not mean that the communities in the northeast and mainland India in terms of their aspirations are different. Definitely there are some differences, but then what combines the kind of commonalities and similarities one can observe when it comes to tribal communities all over India is the question of autonomy. Now, I also, before I proceed, I also wanted to remind you that it is not that all tribal communities in the northeast or all tribal communities in the mainland part of India are under the schedules. There are many tribal communities who are not under any 5th or any 6th schedules. For example, in the state of Manipur in northeast India, although the hill tribes or the tribal communities live in inhabit 90% of the total geographical area of the state, the 6th schedule was not extended to the states of Manipur. Likewise, in the case of Nagaland, they have rejected the idea of 6th schedule. In Arunachal Pradesh, now the tribal communities begin to demand 6th schedule. But in Assam also, there are certain communities who were being granted in today Assam, who were being granted 6th schedule, but for a long period of time, many tribal communities in Assam itself were not under 6th schedule. Likewise, one can also say the same case, for many tribal communities in mainland part of India. Now, this is just a kind of diagrammatic representation of where the two schedules are in force. The green shades mostly is the 6th schedule area and the pink shade is mostly the 5th schedule areas. So, the insertion of the 5th and the 6th schedule was in some way a realization of the aspirations of tribal communities. So, whether or not the tribal communities were satisfied with it, whether or not the schedules work in terms of its promise, that is a different matter altogether. But then what actually it does is the idea behind the insertion of this the 5th and the 6th schedule in the Constitution of India is essentially to assure the tribes that their rights and their interests will be protected by the Constitution of India. Despite that, the Constitution has not actually really defined, or in terms of coming up with a clear definition of how to identify scheduled areas. But one can say that there are certain criteria that have been that have become well established in declaring any area a scheduled area. For instance, a very important criteria that is being used is that before an area is to be declared as a scheduled area, one has to actually identify whether particular area has tribal population in majority, the area should be of a reasonable size, economic backwardness of the area with respect to other states. So, scholars like David Stuligros argues that these autonomy provisions in the form of the 5th and 6th schedules work effectively as a policy of integration of communities into multicultural Indian nation. Now, this idea is particularly important in the sense that on independence there are so many communities in India, and definitely it was a challenge to meet the aspirations of all the communities. But then the kind of promise that these schedules bring to the communities, particularly when one talks about tribes, is important because it serves as a tool. It serves as a tool of integration of communities by assuring them that they are part of this larger multicultural Indian nation. Now, in the next few slides, we will take a glance of the kind of autonomy provisions in terms of the powers that are enshrined under the 5th schedule and also the powers enshrined under the 6th schedule. What actually are they? how do they work, what is the structure of governance, within the two schedules. So, the origin of the 5th schedule in the Indian constitution goes back to the colonial period, when the British government identified some regions as backward tracts and partially excluded areas. Now, I think some of you might have recalled this idea of backward tracts, right, and partially excluded areas. Now, like I said, this on independence, it was not that the entire colonial legislations, the post-colonial Indian state did not entirely neglect the kind of laws and legislations that were introduced by the Britishers. Many of them were being taken forward, of course, with some kind of modifications and adjustments. Now, in the case of autonomy provisions in the 5th schedule as well, what we are seeing is that most of these 5th schedules are being implemented in regions which were identified by the colonial state as backward tracts and partially excluded areas. Now, you know that this idea of backward tracts came up with the Government of India Act of 1935, but before that the idea was already in circulation, particularly with the coming of the Government of India Act 1919, that specifically designate areas which are dominated by tribal communities as backward tracts and partially excluded areas. The Indian constitution adopted this idea by classifying certain regions with large tribal population as scheduled areas. These are the areas where the 5th schedules are applied. Now, one of the criteria, like I said, to define or to declare any area as scheduled area is in terms of population. Now, if you look at this, map, you will see that only for the 6th schedule, which are definitely which are the pink shades here, you will see that they are mostly concentrated in the central part of India, particularly in the Chotanagpur area. Now, if you look at today's Chotanagpur area, Jharkhand, West Bengal, Chhattisgarh and all, you will see that these states, including Madhya Pradesh, and one can go till Gujarat as well, Maharashtra also. You will see that these states have a very, very significant tribal population. Now, up in the north as well, like in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh also, there are a significant tribal population, but then the vast majority or the concentration of tribal communities when it comes to the mainland India is mostly in these states, right, Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat and parts of Rajasthan as well. So, the 5th schedule is an important mechanism when it comes to understanding tribal governance in mainland India, and this schedule outlines how the scheduled areas should be governed. First, it is the President of India who has the authority to declare a region as a scheduled area and can also later decide to remove the status. Now, in many ways any kind of laws and legislations I mean under the Constitution of India, it has to be extended by the President. The President has to give assent to the law. Likewise, whether or not a region, an area needs to be or has to be declared as a scheduled area, the President of India is the one who has the authority to declare any such region as a scheduled area. And in case there are some changes in terms of demographic changes or any other changes, the President can also remove that status. Second, the governor of a state that has scheduled areas must send regular reports at least once a year or is directed to the President about how these areas are being managed. Currently, the 5th schedule is enforced in parts of 10 Indian states. So, we have already briefly talked about the states where the 5th schedule is currently enforced. Now, in areas or in states where the 5th schedule is enforced, the role of the governor is very, very important, because the governor has the duty to send regular reports, maybe in the form of annual reports at least once a year, about the status of these scheduled areas that would specifically deals with the tribal communities there. Now, part B of the 5th schedule has provisions of setting up Tribes Advisory Council TAC in each state with scheduled areas. A TAC can also be created in other states with significant tribal population if the President deems necessary. Now, the first structure of governance that we have seen is the governor. The governor has a very important role to play in trying to really assess and understand the issues and problems concerning scheduled areas, and also point out the kind of development challenges in tribal areas. Another important structure of governance that we have under the 5th schedule is the Tribes Advisory Council. Now, under this TAC, its council should have 20 members with at least 3/4 of them being scheduled tribal MLAs or MLAs who are from scheduled tribe backgrounds from that particular state. The main role of the TAC is to advise the governor on issues related to the welfare and development of tribal communities. Now, this schedule gives the governor significant powers. He or she can decide that certain areas or central laws should not apply to the scheduled area or apply them with specific changes. Now, TSC, the Tribes Advisory Council. Now, if you look at the tribal situation today, like I said, in the past, in the pre-colonial period, and particularly during the colonial period, what we see is that tribal communities in India are continually dispossessed, from the kind of resources or the kind of regions they inhabit. Now, this dispossession resulted into significant pauperization of tribal communities. Now, what happened is that the question of autonomy is very much closely tied to the question of socio-economic development of tribal communities. Now, therefore, the role of the TSC is very important here in terms of giving advice to the governor of a state on issues pertaining to the welfare and development of tribal communities. Likewise, like I said, the governor has a very important role to play when one talks about the 5th schedule, because all of us knows by now, understood that tribal communities, most of them or even all of tribal communities have their own distinct cultural language, and many a times the kind of legislations that are introduced in the state can work against the interests of the tribes in terms of undermining their customary rights, in terms of undermining their traditional institutions. Now, in such kind of situations, the governor can actually intervene and decide whether a particular state or central laws should be directly applied in the scheduled area. So, these protective mechanisms actually were to serve the interests of the tribes against not only preventing the cultural erosion of their the cultural erosion of the tribal communities, but also in terms of the dominance of against the dominance of the larger dominant communities in whichever states tribal communities live. However, this can also be done after consulting the TSC and with the President's approval. The governor also has the authority to make special rules for the governance of these areas, especially to stop or limit land transfers involving members, control how land is allotted to tribal people, regulate money lending activities to prevent exploitation of tribal communities. These protections were included because historically tribal communities heavily relied on land for their survival, and during colonial times they suffered greatly due to land loss and resource exploitation. Now, this is a point that I have been coming back and again and again. Now, this point is important essentially because it resulted into a lot of unrest, it resulted into a lot of movements. If you look at all the tribal movements, many of the tribal movements that happened during the colonial period, more than 100 movements, big or small, happened during the colonial period, not only in mainland India, but even northeastern part of India as well. Now, why did these things happen? Essentially because they see that the resources are being taken away, and it is leading to a lot of socio-economic deprivation. At the same time, the entry of the colonial state in tribal territories means that they are losing their political sovereignty. Now, in that kind of situation, therefore, the demand that essentially made by tribal communities at the dawn of independence is that they want autonomy that will guarantee them socio, cultural, economic and political rights. Now, in this context, within the 5th schedule areas, the governor has a very important role. Like I said, one, the governor can actually decide whether certain state or central laws should be applied to tribal areas which are under the schedule areas. Second, the governor also has the authority to make special rules for the governance of these areas, for instance in terms of land transfer. Now, one of the most pressing concern of tribal communities today is the question of land alienation, that is the transference of tribal of lands owned by the tribal communities to non-tribals or for any other purpose. Now, in that kind of situation the governor has a very important role to play in terms of ensuring that land transfer is being stopped or control land transfer, which essentially will also control the alienation of land that is happening. Another important issue is in terms of money lending. Now, many tribal communities in many parts of India face severe exploitation essentially because of money lending, that money lenders charge exorbitant rates, and many a times they also end up losing their properties, their lands, and so on and so forth. Now, in that kind of situation, the governor can actually come and intervene and set up a kind of mechanism that will actually protect them, the tribal communities, from economic marginalization. Now, the role of the TSC extends to provide consultation to state governor to repeal or amend any act of parliament or the state legislature which applies to the scheduled areas. The governor in consultation with the TSC can make regulations on issues such as regulation of land transfer or allotment of land to the scheduled tribes, regulation of money lending activities. However, all such regulations must be consented by the president. Now, this is something that I have discussed quite extensively already. So, I am not going to explain it again, but what is important for us to really understand in the context of the 5th schedule is the role of the governor. Now, let us come to the 6th schedule. What about the 6th schedule? What is the nature? What is the structure of administration? What is the structure of governance when it comes to 6th schedule? How is it different from the 5th schedule areas? Now, like I said, the 6th schedule was a provision that was essentially introduced specifically for the tribal communities in Northeast India, particularly in today in the state of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram. Now, like I said, during independence till 1962, all these states like Nagaland, Mizoram, Meghalaya, they were part of Assam. They were later on bifurcated from Assam with the reorganization of the northeastern region, and it was in these states today were merely districts, but during that period 6th schedule was already enforced. Now, even after they became state, like in the state of Meghalaya, the 6th schedule was retained. In Mizoram, in the southern part, there are three autonomous district councils which are under 6th schedule, that is the Lai Autonomous Council, the Chakma Autonomous Council and the Mara Autonomous Council. Now, these 3 councils are under the 6th schedule areas. So, the 6th schedule as a provision was essentially designed for the northeastern part of India. So, the idea behind providing the different provisions for governance to these states comes from the understanding that the tribes residing in these 4 states are less adopted to the culture of mainstream society and still largely rooted in their own culture, customs and civilizations. So, here again the question of difference comes play a very prominent role in terms of understanding the northeastern tribal communities. Now, in mainland India, since the tribal communities are exposed to the larger cultural world of the dominant communities, there are far more socio-cultural interactions. But in the case of the Northeast India also, I am not saying that these communities have lived in complete isolation, but then the kind of the nature of interaction with the culture of the larger Indian society was something which was very minimal. It was not something that was by choice also. Geography also plays a very important role, and furthermore colonial policies in the form of Government of India Act in terms of segregating this population within certain administrative areas by isolating them also reinforce in many ways the isolation of the tribal communities in the northeast. Now, therefore, the idea of granting 6th schedule to tribal communities in the northeast essentially arises from this understanding that tribal communities in the northeast have a distinct culture, they have a distinct language, distinct customs and traditions which require state recognition and protection. Now, the 6th schedule, under the 6th schedule, there are these autonomous district councils, or the schedule have a provisions for autonomous district councils in the tribal dominated regions in the 4 states. And initially, like the 5th schedule, it was proposed the idea of 6th schedule was essentially proposed for the formerly excluded areas. Now, these formerly excluded areas are what I have talked about, like the state of Mizoram, Nagaland in particular. So, they were declared as the excluded areas, considered to be one of the most backward regions under the colonial state. The importance of ADCs for tribal governance stems from first how the colonial government indirectly ruled the tribal dominated regions where general laws and legislations were not applicable, and second, the dominance of tribal population in this region is significantly higher with respect to the central tribal regions. Now, like I said, one is a very important part of why these laws was introduced was that the colonial state the colonial policies in terms of governing these regions in an indirect manner, or sometimes more popularly it is known as indirect rule, in a sense that provincial laws were not directly applicable to the areas which are declared as excluded areas. Now, likewise, there are different kind of legislation such as the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act 1873, which was enforced in the state of today's Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland and Mizoram, and in these states a special permit needs to be acquired to visit these states, not only by Indian citizens, but also by the British themselves. So, therefore, a special kind of a layer, administrative layer, different layers of administration was being enforced that actually limit the possibility of getting inside these areas, which further reinforce their exclusion. Now, in the post colonial period also, there was this there was this idea that certain form of provisions needs to be introduced, needs to be inserted in the constitution that will guarantee these communities some level of autonomy. So, as such, the integration is viewed the autonomy of tribal dominated regions as essential for maintaining their distinct socio-cultural practices. The ADCs are mostly demarcated based on the territories of tribal units, which Tolly-Gross argued is the only instance of governmental boundaries are drawn in congruence with social identities. Now, in many parts of Northeast India, you will see that Northeast India is also peculiar, because unlike many parts of mainland India, in northeastern part of India, you will see that it is the tribal communities who are the dominant communities, like in Mizoram, more than 80% of the population are tribes. In Meghalaya also the same thing. In Nagaland also it is same scenario. In Manipur, in Arunachal Pradesh, it is like 65% of the entire population, they say the tribal communities. In Manipur, it is about 35 to 40. So, you will see that although there are some variations in in Tripura and Manipur, but in the larger part of the northeastern states, you will see that tribal communities are the dominant, which is a situation that is very different when one looks at where tribal populations are concentrated in mainland part of India. So, under this 6th schedule, like I said, there are these provisions for setting up autonomous district councils. Now, its autonomous district and region have district and regional council consisting of 30 members who administer the areas under their jurisdiction. Now, today in Assam, where are these 6th schedule enforced? If I say that 6th schedule is enforced in the state of Assam, it does not mean that the entire Assam is under 6th schedule. The entire state in Mizoram is under 6th schedule. That is not essentially the case. So, over a period of time, what happened is that the 6th schedule has been enforced, or the areas which were under 6th schedule gradually increased. Initially, it was only Meghalaya and Mizoram, and now it has expanded to new areas like Tripura and also in Assam, in many parts of Assam. So, for example, today the areas where 6th schedules are enforced in Assam are the North Kachar Hill districts, the Karbi Anglong district, the Bodo territorial areas district. In Meghalaya, we have Khasi Hills district, the Jaintia Hill district, the Garo Hills district. In Tripura, we have the Tripura tribal areas district. In Mizoram, we have the Chakma, the Mara and the Lai. Now, all of this when a 6th schedule is enforced specifically for a particular community, then it means that they can create their own autonomous district councils under which members are being elected. Now, these autonomous district councils, now one important thing that that is important for us to understand is the structure of autonomy provisions between the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule is different. Now, in the 6th schedule, what we see is that there is more of a decentralization of power that is happening, where the power actually goes to the people, in a sense that they have the right to elect their own representatives through the autonomous district councils. Now, under these autonomous district councils, these communities who are under the 6th schedule can make laws on local matters such as distribution and use of land for farming, grazing, housing or other purposes that benefit villagers or town residents, management of forests not marked as reserve, use of canals or water system for agriculture, regulation of Jhum cultivation, shifting cultivation, formation of village or town councils and defining their powers, village and town administration including police, sanitation and public health, appointment and succession of tribal chiefs or headmen, inheritance, marriage, divorce and local social customs. So, essentially you will see that these autonomous councils are endowed with a lot of powers, a lot of responsibilities, and at the same time, although they are responsible for the management of local resources such as land, forest, they also play a very important role in terms of protecting the customs and traditions of the tribal communities. And the moment that and at the moment a 6th schedule is enforced and ADCs are constituted, it means that the tribal communities have the provisions, the protection to safeguard their rights, to safeguard their interests. Now, in addition to this, they can also make laws about basic services like primary schools, clinics, markets, livestock, shelters, ferries, fishing, roads and waterways. Now, you can see that the autonomous district councils have a plethora of provisions, not only in terms of customs and traditions, but also in terms of the management of infrastructure, the management of the possibility of managing developmental schemes in the form of, for example, looking after primary schools, clinics, markets, livestock shelters, so on and so forth. Now, They also have the authority to regulate money lending and trade by outsiders or non-tribal people, collect taxes on property, trades, animals, ports, goods entering local markets, ferry services, among others, grant licenses and leases for exploring and extracting minerals and receive a portion of the mineral royalties earned by the state. Importantly, the state laws do not automatically apply in this autonomous district. The district council must approve them first. Now, under the autonomous district councils, they have their own assembly. Now, for example, let me explain this important point. This point is very important with the example of Mizoram. Now, in Mizoram, you will see that the dominant communities are the Mizos. Now, the Mizos at one point of time also have their own 6th schedule. But once the state of Mizoram was upgraded to a statehood, a full statehood, was granted a full statehood, the 6th schedule was no longer enforced in the larger part of the state. Now, the 6th schedule was continued only in 3 autonomous district councils, that is the Chakma Autonomous District Council, the Lai Autonomous District Council and the Mara Autonomous District Councils. Now, these communities always wanted to protect their interests from the dominant communities culturally, linguistically, so on and so forth. Now, whenever the Mizoram State Assembly passed legislation, it cannot be directly implemented in these areas. First, it has to be approved by the district council themselves. So, therefore, it gives them a kind of layer that actually protect their interests from the dominant communities. So, the governor decides whether or not laws made by parliament or the state legislature should be applied in these areas, particularly in Assam, Tripura and Mizoram. In states other than Assam, even the President of India can decide on the application of such laws. Likewise, apart from different administrative powers that are being endowed to the autonomous district councils, they also have judicial powers to handle legal cases and operate a two-tier, two-level system. One is the village councils that deals with cases between tribal people, while district level courts handle appeals. These councils follow procedure under the civil procedure court and the criminal procedure court for handling certain legal matters. Its autonomous district and region also has its own fund where all government allocations are pooled for local use. So, now you can see that the 6th schedule are far more powerful, are far more capable as compared to the Tribes Advisory Council in the 5th schedule areas. Essentially here, because the kind of roles and responsibilities, the provisions, the powers which are being enshrined are clearly delineated, and there is a structure in place that will actually ensure that the rights and provisions are being followed, in a sense that the communities who are under the autonomous district councils have the right to protect themselves from the dominant communities within the state that they live. So, but at the same time the governor play a very, very important role. For instance, it can suspend or dissolve a council, temporarily take over its powers and then report the matter to the state legislature. This suspension can last up to 1 year unless overturned by the legislature. Moreover, the governor can set up a commission to study any issue related to the administration of these autonomous areas. Based on the commission's recommendations, the governor has also the power to dissolve a district or regional council. Now, again you will see that there are some kind of commonalities between the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule in terms of suspending or dissolving a council, but at the same time the governor also can play a very, very positive role in terms of studying any kind of specific issues pertaining to the administration of the autonomous district council areas. Besides the 6th schedule, the Indian constitution also provides special provisions for some northeastern states to give them more autonomy. For example, Article 371A applies to Nagaland and give the state control over matters like religion, traditional customs, its own civil and criminal laws, and ownership of land and natural resources. The state of Mizoram also has special protections under Article 371Z. Although parts of the state are also governed by the 6th schedule, like I said, in the southern part, the 3 autonomous district councils are governed under the 6th schedule. In the case of Manipur, Article 371C is enforced, and also there is a state legislations as a state law out of which autonomous councils or district councils are being created under the Manipur Hill Areas District Council Act. However, the level of self-governance granted here is not as strong as the autonomy provided under the 6th schedule. Now, the 6th schedule is a constitutional body. Now, when the autonomous district council in states such as Manipur are necessarily not, because they are being created under the state law. So, there is a huge difference in terms of power and responsibilities. there is a huge difference in terms of what an autonomous judicial council can do. Now, in the case of Manipur, for instance, if a law is being passed by the legislative assembly, the state legislative assembly, then it can be enforced in the entire state. Now, if you have structures like 6 scheduled areas, what it means is that the laws are not directly applicable until and unless the district council themselves consented to the laws. Now, so with this I am going to end this lecture, but I think that we have a fair idea about the 5th and the 6th schedule, two very important structures of autonomy and two very important autonomy provisions that one cannot ignore when one talks about the question of autonomy in the context of tribal communities. Thank you so much.